This is not a new observation. Vickery, in his 1961 paper, in which he invented this auction format, he basically said this is one of the problems of this auction format, that you can exaggerate the second highest bid, and as a result, bidders cannot. Bidders should trust the auctioneer in order for this mechanism to make sense. On the other hand, in a first price auction, I'm going to receive two bids, B1 and B2. Well, the auctioneer could be an auction theorist who says, hey, Mohammad, I know that the fact that you have bid 95 in a first price auction means your value is more than 95. So I'm going to invert your bid, identify your value, and then come to you and say, hey, I know your value is 100. How about you pay me 99? Now, the auctioneer can do that, but the key difference between this and the previous example is that now I can detect the auctioneer without needing to talk to anyone else. I can say, hey, this is against the rules of the game. And this is, again, not a new observation. William Vickery, in his, again, classic paper, called first price auction automatically self-policing, whereas the second price auction is not like that. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk, in the next 55 minutes, is to formalize the idea of automatically self-policing mechanisms, which we actually call it credible mechanisms, and see and investigate the properties of this mechanism. So we will get there to the formality. But before that, let me tell you that, let me give you a lot of examples from the real world that you guys might be interested in, knowing that this is a serious challenge out there. The first example is online advertising. The second price auction has always been the lovely, the poster child of success in auction theory. One of the reasons was that the online advertising platforms constantly use second price auction. And around 2017, the people started getting worried that maybe ad exchanges are cheating in these second price auctions. This is a quote from the industry newsletter, that in a second price auction, raising the price floors after bids come in allows the auctioneer to make extra cash off unsuspecting buyers. So the way they cheat in these auctions, or at least that was the suspicion, was that the bids come in and then you say, hey, my reserve price was actually higher than the second highest bid. So you're going to charge them the reserve price, which you invented after bids came in. And the reason this practice persists is because neither the publisher nor the ad buyer has complete access to all the data involved in the transaction. So it's like one key part of our modeling, and I think a lot is left to be done, is how you model this data sharing type of, like what's the information structure? What do bidders observe? We're going to take one extreme, which I will tell you. But there are so many like intermediate regimes one can think about. Another example is like when we were working on this paper in 2019, 2020, then 2021, and so on. We were always asked, okay, but companies have reputation to lose. Like Google is not going to do that, right? There is no way they're going to put their reputation at risk. Now, what I'm going to do, since this being recorded, is to show you a few quotes from the recent lawsuit against Google. These are allegations. These are not like proofs. I'm totally neutral in this case. But this is one of the paragraphs in the Texas case against Google, which says they invented this notion called reserve price optimization, RPO, that overrode a publisher's exchange floors and deceptively increase the amount advertisers pay for impressions on Google Exchange. So they had this idea that after they observed the bid, they had this reserve price optimization. That's the allegation. The other example is this example from the same lawsuit, that it's a piece from an email between people inside the company, that one of them asks the other one, doesn't that what we are doing, the RPO, undermine the whole idea of second price auction, i.e. the assurance that you can bid the maximum you're willing to pay with no negative consequence. But if the publisher manufactures a floor based on your bid to get you pay more than the second price, this principle gets violated, which is exactly what I just told you. So these are a few examples of worries, at least, that people have. And I mean, I love this last part. The auction, if companies are allowed to do that, they are allowed to change the reserve price, this will de facto transform the system into a first price auction. Because if I know you can charge me my bit minus epsilon, from my view, I'm playing a first price auction, not a second price auction. So we will see. This would be actually, this was one of the theorems of our paper, that in the world in which you cannot trust the auctioneer, a second price auction would be played as if it's a first price auction. Just to make sure we know how an ascending auction works in practice. I mean, you guys are in New York City. These art auctions are happening all the time, and
Mohammad,
it turns out.
There's a question from the audience, if that's okay. So
perfect.
Would you mind going back to the last page? Just a clarifying question. What is the publisher in this case, from my own context? Like in the Google case, is Google the publisher, or who is the?
No, think of the publisher being the New York Times. There is a display ad when you go to the New York Times on top of the page, and advertisers compete for that. The ad exchange is the intermediary who receives the ads, chooses the winner, charges them the second highest bid, and then puts the ad in the New York Times page, and basically they pay all of the money of the ad to New York Times except the take rate of 20%. So
New York Times is doing the RPO, or is Google doing the RPO here?
The RPO is being done by Google, the auctioneer. So the auctioneer is intermediating between the seller, New York Times, and the buyer, the advertisers.
Got it.
Yeah, think of publisher as Christie's, like the art house that is selling an art piece, or a real estate agent that is selling a house to a buyer.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. So in art auctions, there is this like super exciting, not exciting, super interesting, the practice that's called chandelier bidding. So in ascending auctions, they say, who is willing to pay 10 million? Someone says yes, who is willing to pay 11 million? And the auctioneer can say, oh, there is that guy who is willing to pay 11 million, even though there is no human being who was willing to pay 11 million. They can do that. And this is legal based on New York City laws. So the regulation allows you to have a secret reserve price, which means you can fabricate bids up to a certain number without really having someone who is willing to pay that. Now, just to be clear, if everyone is in the same room and everyone is observing everything that's happening, that's one way to think about communication and data sharing. When we look at the data, even in art auctions that are these ascending auctions, most bidders are not in the room. Many of them are over the phone, many of them are on internet online bidding. So the way the communication happens is that, like Christie's and Sotheby's have this staff who call these people and say, hey, the current highest price is 20 million. Are you willing to pay 21? Or they are on internet. So this flow of information, how this happens, is going to be super important for us. I'm just going through details because that would be the key modeling assumption. There was a question. Good. Great. So what I'm going to do in this paper, we're going to think of a world in which think of auctions by telephone. So you have all these bidders who are on different phone lines. So they have a private communication channel with the auctioneer. And then we're going to ask in which formats does the auctioneer want to follow the rules of the game. Okay, let me get a little bit more clear about this. So the communication structure is going to be this. So the auctioneer has private communication channels with each bidder, but bidders cannot talk to each other. The classic mechanism design communication structure is a complete graph. So everyone can talk to everyone and sees everything. Okay, so think of that as like there is like you observe everything that happens between everyone. So here I'm assuming that no one observed, bidders observe only their own communication with the auctioneer, which is like a pretty reasonable assumption for the world of online advertising. We could start thinking about like different contexts, but let's continue with that. So the auctioneer is going to be the nexus of communication, makes these communications with the bidders potentially in multiple rounds, just not just necessarily one round. And so the auctioneer can misrepresent to me what Tim has told the auctioneer. So I'm going to say that an auction is credible if it's incentive compatible for the auctioneer to follow the rules of the game in this form of communication structure. And what do I mean by incentive compatible is that the auctioneer can play the rules of the game according to the book, or the auctioneer can deviate, but the deviations should be such that no single bidder can detect the auctioneer. Okay, I will formalize it using like math in 20 minutes. But the idea is pretty simple. It's that the auctioneer can tell you, hey, the second highest bid was something else, but cannot tell you, hey, your bid was something else. Or you told me in the ascending auction that you are still in, but I tell you, hey, you said you are out. So you cannot misrepresent to me whatever happens between us, but you can misrepresent whatever happens between other people. And those misrepresentations also should be such that I cannot detect you. Sometimes I can detect you because you said something that even with my information, I can catch you.
I have a question. So like for the problem you mentioned, like what about using, let's say, digital signatures? So let's say the auctioneer must, if I claim the second price is A, I must present a digital signature, let's say signed by Kim with the claimed price. Like would that just solve the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I'm happy to be here because I'm sure you guys are going to come up with a lot of ideas around this. So a couple of like reactions in favor of the idea, and then the idea of the paper is that the auctioneer can always even invent those signatures in principle. So in a real estate auction, if you're playing a second price auction, the seller agent can always like write down a fake offer. So then you get to the point that you have to go through auditing and stuff like that to make sure these offers are real. So these like in a way you have to think about like the auctioneer's cousin in some worlds. The other one is like the logistics, and in a way we are part of this paper is explaining why some auction formats were super popular historically before we had blockchains, before we had cryptography, before we had these signatures. These are all things that could potentially alleviate the credibility problem in settings that you can actually implement digital signatures. Or, I mean, Matt Weinberg, who was visiting you guys, he has, I think, 3 papers or 2 or 3 papers exactly around implementing credibility using cryptography. So that's a great question, and you're totally right. If that's possible, then. But notice that in an auction in which people are not sophisticated, at least, that would be really challenging, because now I have to trust the whole signature and learn how it works and stuff like that.
So maybe just to follow up on the question, like you mentioned that the auctioneer can invent bids. So is this in an open participation setting where like the set of bidders is not known? Like let's say I can just create some pseudonyms and join, basically the auctioneer can pretend it's a bidder.
Yeah, in the model, I'm gonna assume that the set of bidders, there are like n participants. This is like the set of all potential participants, like including the auctioneer's cousin. But yes, the answer I gave you is basically was outside the model. I assume that auctioneer brought someone from the outside. But the model, you will see the model in a slide. It's gonna tell you that the number of bidders is known ex ante. And it's interesting what happens if that assumption is dropped. But anyways, that's a great question. And how can you overcome this issue of credibility is very much context dependent. It's very hard to do these digital signatures in some contexts and easy to do in some other contexts. So let me move by just giving you a glimpse of the results. I'm not gonna probably have time to prove these results, but we will come back to them later. But if you take this definition of credibility, just to give you a sense of why this is potentially a useful concept. If you take this definition of credibility and put it in the Meyerson optimal auction setting, in a simple version of that, suppose you have regular distributions, Meyerson regularity assumption, you have IID values for bidders. There is an auctioneer who wants to sell an item. And suppose only winners are going to make transfers, losers are not going to pay. And suppose auctioneer's objective function is revenue. Then we know from the Green-Lafont-Holmestrom theorem, the Green-Lafont and Holmestrom at the same time proved this result, that if you want a mechanism that's static, meaning that you have only one round of communication, so people tell you their type and you do something with their types, and you want a mechanism that's truthful, it's a strategy proof, or dominant strategy incentive compatible, these three names are the same for me. Then the unique mechanism that satisfies these properties is the second price auction. So there is no other mechanism that satisfies these properties. That's the Green-Lafont-Holmestrom theorem. So the question we ask is, suppose now you want a mechanism that's static, but also credible. We know second price auction is not credible. That's by inspection. It turns out that there is one mechanism that satisfies this property, which is first price auction. It's Meyerson first price auction with Meyerson reserve, and it's the only mechanism that satisfies this property. So there is no other mechanism that's both credible and static. And then if you say, okay, I'm willing to give up this staticness, I mean, I'm happy to have a, like, Christie and Sotheby's, like, a dynamic auction type. In the space of all possible dynamic mechanisms that you can have, is there a mechanism that's both a strategy proof and credible? And the second main theorem of the paper is that there is one, and there is only one, essentially, and that's the ascending auction. The English auction in which you start at the reserve price and you increase the price epsilon by epsilon. You don't have price jump. You go just up at minimum allowed like number that you can go up. And that's the unique credible strategy proof auction. So in a way, this credibility together with the staticness and the strategy proofness helps us think about like a characterization of the three most common auction formats out there in the world. You cannot have all three properties at the same time. And each two of them characterizes one of the like classic auction formats.
And Mohammad, just to clarify, this is all within the space of revenue maximal auctions, right?
Yes,
auctions.
Absolutely. Yeah, one key, exactly.
Okay, so if you gave up a little bit on revenue, maybe this design space would get a lot richer.
Exactly. So if for example, the auctioneer wants, I mean, if there is any positive weight on revenue and some positive weight on efficiency, still you get this. But if you only care about efficiency, then all of them are credible. So in a way, it's actually a super important question that you asked him, because credibility is highly tied to the incentives of the auctioneer. So you have to tell me what is the utility function. Like the National Residency Matching Program that Al Roth and his colleagues designed, if the utility of the NRMP is the match is to maximize hospitals like utility, then then you can be worried about the credibility. If it's to maximize doctors' utility, then you shouldn't be worried because they are running doctor proposing. So that's context dependent.
All right, and what does the regular IID values mean on the left top corner?
Oh, it means that each bidder has a value for the item that is being sold. The distribution is the same for everyone. It's IID. It's identical and independent. And regular is just it says that basically the value minus inverse hazard rate of distribution is increasing. So it's an assumption that many natural distributions satisfy, but not all of them. These results will go through even without regularity. There are ways to do non-regular credibility analysis.
Mohammad, dumb question, and we've talked about this paper many times, but for some reason I've never thought about this before. Like, what would happen if you created friction to the auctioneer manipulating? Like, to what is there a sense in which making it hard relative? I guess it should sort of be continuous. So if there's a sense in which making it hard relative to the gain from misrepresenting the reserve price or something like that. Like you've mostly committed to it, but you can pay some big cost to swap it out. You're only going to do if the returns are high. Is that the right intuition?
Yeah, that's a great. Yeah, that's a. We have not thought about those. You could even include some small probability of being audited, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you start. Yeah, I totally expect that as that cost gets higher and higher, like the deviations become only for very highly profitable stuff, you're gonna actually deviate from the rules of the game.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Another question, like when you say it's the only mechanism, does that also take into account randomized mechanism? So is it like in the space of possibly randomized mechanism?
Yeah, I should have been more clear. Yeah, we are gonna totally rule out like the chance moves. The randomization, if you assume you have a public randomization device, that's a different thing because it's something that everyone can verify the outcome of. If for randomization you have to trust the auctioneer, then that, of course, no mechanism becomes credible because the auctioneer can play with the randomization however they like. It's an amazing direction to see if there is a public randomization device, what can you do with credibility?
But I didn't understand that point. Why do you say if it's randomized, it cannot be credible? Because it could be that if the auctioneer picks randomness, it doesn't improve its
So one feature of, jumping forward, one feature of credibility is that once you put a bid or report something to the mechanism, you have to know exactly what would be your payment if you win. If that number has if there is more than one number you could potentially pay, then the auctioneer is always going to charge you the higher number. So either the randomization is irrelevant. By the way, I'm coming up with this answer on the spot. Maybe I have to think more and get back to you after the talk. But if there are two numbers and the randomization is going to determine one of them with some probability, of course, I'm always going to tell you, hey, the higher number ended up being the right number. So one feature of there is a result in the paper that says a mechanism is credible if I know, it has to be the case that conditional on, as a function of your report, you exactly know your payment. Now, what happens if randomization is publicly observable? As I said, that's actually interesting. Abdu?
Yeah, thanks, Mohammad. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, in this ascending auction, what will be the information that will be revealed to other bidders? Is it just that?
I will get there. Let me get there by the end of the talk. Basically, you only observe your own commute. So the ascending auction says, hey, Abdu, are you willing to pay 20? You say yes. 21, yes. 22, no. But you don't know really what's happening out there. The auctioneer could have a bid of 21 or 22 or could not. Cool. Let me do a little bit of modeling. Those of you who know mechanism design, it's going to be obvious. For those of you who don't know, it's going to be easy. So there is a set of agents, N, and then there is a type space, which is like, think of type as the value, potential values that bidders can have. So each bidder has a value for the item that is being sold. There is a probability measure for the types. There is a set of potential outcomes. In an auction, it's who wins and how much they pay, for example, or who wins and how much everyone pays. That's an outcome. The utility of bidders is a function of what happened in the auction, their type to a real number. So in an auction, it's basically your value minus price. The utility of an auctioneer is the new piece in this model, which is, again, a function of the outcome, the set of types of all bidders to a real number. So this could be revenue, but this could also be efficiency, in which case the utility of the auctioneer is just the type of the highest bidder. And then for each agent, we are going to have an information partition, which is the minimal physical restrictions that you have. Okay, the auctioneer can potentially create more limitations, but one example of this partition that the bidder observed, this is something that the auctioneer cannot choose. This X, this notion of partition I have. So you observe your own payment, but you observe, I direct my own payment, directly observe it, but I do not observe team's payments. Now the auction could be designed such that the auctioneer even reveals team's payment for me. That's an option the auctioneer has. But the auctioneer cannot hide my own payment from me. Okay, that's the key assumption here, that there is a minimal level of stuff that you cannot lie to me. For example, you cannot sell me a fake Mona Lisa. I mean, that's not, I can always observe whether I actually want the Mona Lisa. So
just a question, what is this B? What's this probability measure?
Oh, it's just a distribution of types. So for each person, I know my own type value for the item, but what I know about other people is just a distribution. And auctioneer only knows the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So like, for example, just the valuation distribution, right?
Exactly. So think of it as the value distribution in an auction. So we are going to work with extensive game forms. I'm going to implement a game, and this is the part that mechanism design typically escapes, because working with extensive game forms is a mess. We love revelation principle because we don't have to work with extensive game forms. But in this world, we have to do it because we don't have the full commitment and the flow of information matters. So I'm going to say that a game is an extensive game form with consequences in the outcome set X. We are going to implement each game using this extensive game form. I'm going to assume games that are finite, there are no chance moves, and players remember what they have done before. So an example of this is an ascending auction. So in the highest part of the tree, I go and ask Abdu, are you willing to pay 10? If he says yes, I go to the left. If he says no, I go to the right. And then I ask Tim, are you willing to pay 11? If he says yes, I go to the left. If he says no, I go to the right. So I have this like multiple rounds of communication. Now, a strategy for a player in this extensive game form is a mapping from their information set, what do they know, what do they observe, their type, to an action. Again, it's in a way super simple. In an ascending auction, your information set is, this is the current highest price out there. Your type is something. Are you going to pay $1 more or not? And then we are going to do a few actions. These are actually from Shengu's Obviously a Strategy Proof Mechanisms paper, which allows us to work with extensive game forms in a tractable way. So we are going to prune the game in the following sense. If there is part of the game tree that for no types of players we're going to play, I'm going to kill that part of the tree. Okay, I'm going to make sure that anything that remains in this tree is actually a positive probability event. There's some types of players that are going to go there. If I go to Tim and say, hey, this is your information, and you only have one action, tell me what you do. Well, I'm going to take that action on his behalf. I'm not going to ask him if there is only one option. So each information set has at least 2 actions. And the last one is that if I go to Tim and say, hey, are you going to play A or B in this information set? And he says A or he says B, but that changes nothing in the game. I'm going to ignore that choice, choose one of them, and continue the game. So these are without loss of generality in a sense that if I have a big game that is non-pruned, that's credible, the pruned game will also be credible. Okay, so for the world of credibility, these are without loss. For game theorists of the crowd, the reason we do this is that we don't want to deal with beliefs of the equilibrium path and sequential equilibrium and all those messy stuff. We're going to work with the lovely Bayes incentive compatible mechanisms because everything is a positive probability. Perfect. So let me tell you an example of what I'm doing here. So this is an example of a second price auction. I go to player 1 and say, hey, are you willing to pay? Basically, I ask, are you a 5 type or a 10 type? Actually, before that, let me tell you about these observations. So this is a second price auction. Player 1 can have a type of 5 or 10. Player 2 can have a type of 5 or 15. If player 1's type is 5 and player 2's type is 15, 2 wins. In fact, if player 2's type is 15, he always wins. But the payment of player 2 is a function of player 1's type. If player 1's type is 5 and 2 is also 5, 1 wins at the price of 5. So I'm assuming tie breaking is in the favor of 1. If player 1 type is 10 and 2 is 5, 1 wins against at the price of 5. So this thing I have down here, the information partitions, is the key object in my analysis. Player 1, what do player 1 observes at the end of the game? Player 1 observes that if he wins, he observes that he won at a price of 5, because that's the only price player 1 can win. If player 2 wins, then player 1 does not observe which price he paid. Okay, notice that if I bid 10, I'm player 1, and player 2 wins, I know that player 2 must have paid 10, but I do not observe it. Okay, I mean that if the auctioneer followed the rules of the game, this should have happened, but I do not observe. I cannot distinguish between these two outcomes. That's why I have them in this bracket. It means from one's perspective, these two are the same. Now, from player 2's perspective, however, if he loses, he knows that player 1 won at a price of 5, so he exactly knows this. And if he wins, he knows that he won at a price of 5 or he won at a price of 10. So player 2 completely observes what happens at the end. Player 1 cannot distinguish between these two outcomes. Now, what happens in the game? I ask 1, hey, what's your bid? He says, my bid is 5. I go to 2. What is your bid? She says, my bid is 15. And notice that by having this like circle-ish, this around player 2, I mean player 2 does not observe player 1's bid. This is a sealed bid auction. So player 2 says, hey, my bid is 15. This is the outcome I have to choose. 2 should win at a price of 5 in a second price auction. The auctioneer is going to change the outcome and deviate from the rules of the game and say, hey, player 2, you won, and the player 1's bid was 10. Okay, this is the way I'm implementing a second price auction using this extensive game form technology, and this is one example of a deviation. Now, here is what I'm going to formally define, but this path that is green is what we call an innocent explanation. An innocent explanation is a story that each player can say to themselves at the end of the game that justifies their observation. So what player 1 observed in this game? Player 1 observed, I paid 5 and I lost the game. So he could say, hey, I paid 5, so we were here, and then probably player 2's type was 15, in which case I lost the game. And player 1 cannot observe whether player 2 paid 5 or 10, so player 1 is completely fine. Okay, this happened, the story makes sense. This is an innocent explanation for player 2. Player 2 observes that his own bid was 15. That one I cannot change. So in my innocent explanation, I'm always on the right side of this tree for player 2. But then he's like, okay, I paid 10. Can I justify that with positive probability? Yes. If player 1's type was 10, which I do not observe, then I win and I pay 10. So this is a story that player 2 can tell herself and justify the observation. In this game, each player has a story that they can say. As a result, this deviation is non-detectable. So I'm going to say deviation is non-detectable if each player has an innocent explanation for their observation. Okay, that's going to be like the most important definition of the paper is this notion of innocent explanation. That every player, based on their own observation and what happened in the game, can justify what happened with positive probability. There was a type of profile that could make this happen. The type of players that could make this happen. So let me tell you a formal definition of this notion. So the way the game works, I'm going to define a new game between the auctioneer and players that incorporates the auction or the mechanism in it. So it's kind of it looks complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. The way it works is that at each step, auctioneer can either end the game and choose an outcome, or go to the next step. In this step 2, the auctioneer chooses one player, sends a message, and tells this player, hey, we are here in the game. And then this player observes this message and chooses a reply privately and tells the auctioneer, hey, this is my reply. And then auctioneer observes this reply and goes back to step 1. Let me give you an example that completely clarifies this. In an ascending auction, auctioneer chooses the first player, goes and says, hey, the price is $10 million. Are you willing to pay? So that's the information set. Says, hey, you are the first player I'm coming to. The price is $10 million, in or out. Player observes and says, I'm in. As a function of that, I go back to step 1. Either I end the game or I go to another player, or the same player. I mean, it doesn't matter. So for any game tree that you give me, this messaging game can implement that game tree. I start at the top of the tree. I go to the player at that point, and I say, hey, this is the current information situation. These are your actions, choose one of them, and then the reply comes in. I go to the next player as a function of the reply. So this is, again, from Shengu's OSP paper. It turns out that actually it's even older than that. Von Neumann and Morgensen in their book, and Roger Myerson in his Informed Principle paper, they de facto defined a notion like this that says there is a person out there who can implement any extensive game form using this messaging game. Now, why this is a cool object? In the world of full commitment, the auctioneer commits to a strategy in this game that actually implements the promise. So this is the strategy of the auctioneer in this game. I'm going to denote it by S00. 0 is the auctioneer. G is the game that the auctioneer has promised to play. So full commitment says, hey, in this game that the auctioneer is playing with players, I'm going to actually do what I promised. In a partial commitment world, the auctioneer can play this commitment or can deviate to any other strategy in this messaging game that no single player can detect and distinguish from that. Okay, so the way we are going to define these deviations is through this messaging game. So the auctioneer is playing a game with you, and he is allowed to change the strategy and not play the strategy that's committed, conditional on the fact that you cannot detect. Let me formalize this notion of, that's my last formalization, which has the notion of innocent explanation defined. So think of a protocol, an ascending auction, for example, G, and the strategy of the players. So strategy of players in an ascending auction is like play yes up to the point that I hit your value and then drop. And then auctioneer has a strategy in this game, in this messaging game, that runs my ascending auction. The strategy is go to the first player, ask in or out, go to the second player, ask in or out, back to the first player, again ask in or out at the new price, and so on. As a function of the game and the strategy of the player, each player is going to have an observation at the end of the game. Your observation is a communication sequence that you had with the auctioneer. That's what you observe, plus what happened at the end. Okay, in an ascending auction, these observations would be the auctioneer came to me, ask in or out, I said yes. Ask in or out at 11 million, I said yes. Ask in or out at 12 million, I said yes. And then ask in or out at 13 million, I said no. And then the outcome is that I lost the game. That's an example of an observation. It's a vector. Now here is the, now of course, this observation is a function of what a strategy the auctioneer plays, what a strategy players play, and the types of players. So if I have the highest type, my observation would be yes, 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 I won. If I don't have the highest type, it would be yes, 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 no, I lost. So this observation is a function of what the auctioneer does, what other players do, and what is everyone's type. And notice that here I don't have this commitment strategy. The auctioneer could play a different game. And that also creates a different observation for me. I'm going to say that the observation that you had has an innocent explanation could be that the auctioneer did not play the right strategy. In a second price auction, the auctioneer charged you your bid minus epsilon. So this observation has an innocent explanation if there is some type of other players that if the auctioneer followed the rules of the game and other players had those types, the observation that this generates for me is exactly what it was. It happened to me right now. Okay, so notice what happened. The auctioneer deviated, played a different game, charged me my bid minus epsilon. But I was able to find a set of types for other players such that if the auctioneer followed the rules of the game, what I observed today as a function of this deviation is exactly that. So one example is if there was actually a bidder whose type was 99, well, what then paying 99 as the second highest bid is actually makes sense. Okay, so innocent explanation is a type of other players that together with auctioneer playing the right strategy justifies whatever you experienced in the game. And then I'm gonna say a strategy for auctioneer is safe if all players and all types of players have an innocent explanation. Okay, so auctioneer is allowed to deviate to any safe strategy, which means whatever the auctioneer does, everyone can tell a story that makes sense. There are no inconsistencies in players' observations in this sense.
Mohammed, quick
Yes.
question. SN just means there's no dynamic strategy on the player's part or on the.
So SN is the strategy of the player in the committed game. Yeah. So it's remember a strategy is a full contingent plan. So it says at each point of this game tree, you're gonna do that. Maybe I'm not gonna hit a lot of the game 3 points, but this actually includes the dynamic consideration because it's a full contingent plan. I mean, I don't have a lot of time, but this is actually kind of an unusual definition of a mechanism, which is the game, the mechanism, and the strategy of player together. We typically say second price auction. We don't say second price auction and everyone bids truthfully. But this pair that I have up here, the G and SN says, this is a second price auction and everyone is going to bid truthfully. I actually think this is a better way to define second price auction because when we say second price auction is efficient, we are implicitly assuming a specific equilibrium strategy of players. Because there is a terrible equilibrium of second price auction that I bid $1 trillion, everyone bids 0. And this is not efficient. So we are working with this pair so that it's clear that we are considering a specific equilibrium strategy of players and it's a full contingent plan.
I have just a clarification question. So everyone has a valid story, but their stories may not be consistent, right? The theta I prime, theta minus I prime is not necessarily the same for all I.
Exactly, absolutely. It's a very good, important question. For each player, let me go back. For each player, I have a different story. As I showed you in that graph, the green path of player 1 was different from the green path of player 2, but each one of them has a consistent story for themselves. Okay, so again, this was the innocent explanation for player 1, the types of players that justified what they observed. This was an innocent explanation for player 2. There is another example in the paper that I'm not going to go through, but it's not that the auctioneer can only change the outcome in this framework. The auctioneer can get a game like this and play an entirely different game. So you can even deviate midway and play a totally different game. We prove in the paper that this game on the right is a safe deviation of the game on the left. I'm not gonna get into that because it's a very long example. But the thing I want you to get from this is that there are midway deviations that the auctioneer can do. It's not just changing the outcome.
Midway deviation, do you mean the message schedule is not static? It's not fixed a priori? Like
midway deviations means, yeah, exactly. I promise that if player 1 here said that I play right, I'm gonna go to player 2, but in principle, I can go to player 3. And you can show that this is a safe deviation.
It's not even like a tree, right? The game is like, because the message ordering is not fixed a priori. It's like when you talk about this extensive form game, it's like usually the player is fixed at every level, but now you're saying the player at every level is not fixed.
I'm saying that it's not fixed in this. There is no calendar time. It's not that I say player 2, hey, I'm gonna call you at 2 p.m. But I have committed that I'm gonna call players in this order on the left. That I will call 1 as a function. Of that response, I go to 3 or 2, and I can change that order. That's possible to do in a safe way. But let me not spend a lot of time on this because I want to get to the last bit of definition. I'm gonna say a protocol is credible if in the space of all possible safe deviations that the auctioneer has, playing the commitment strategy, the strategy that actually implements what you have committed in the book, maximizes the auctioneer's expected utility. So remember, you commit you're gonna play a second price auction. This creates for you a lot of safe deviations and a lot of deviations that are not safe. I mean, of course, you can charge me number more than my bid. That's not a safe deviation. But we are gonna just focus on safe deviations. And if in the space of safe deviations, the commitment strategy maximizes your expected utility, then that's a credible mechanism. And notice that going back to the previous question, this definition implies best responding to updated beliefs as well. So these strategies that I'm considering are full contingent plans. So it's like at any point as a function of whatever other players do, I can change and play a different game. And even though you can do that as a function of new information, you're just gonna follow the rules of the game. That's the idea here. Good. So there is this cute observation that in the world of mechanism design, a mechanism and this like equilibrium strategy of players is base incentive compatible and credible. So you satisfy both of these if and only if in this like messaging game, the strategy that implements that protocol and the strategy of player is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium. Okay, so that's how these worlds get connected. I define this world of messaging game, which is a game between auctioneer and players. A Bayes-Nash equilibrium of this messaging game, if the commitment strategy of the planner is actually a Bayes-Nash equilibrium together with the strategy of the players, then you can only deviate to the like safe deviations. Then your original mechanism is Bayes incentive compatible and credible. So let me get to the auction application. So this is actually funny because in the paper when we wrote, we said, here is an example of a Midway credible deviation. So you're a seller, you choose a price for the object and tell it to the buyer. And the object is sold if the price of the buyer, so there's an auctioneer with a seller and a buyer. The seller chooses a price, the auctioneer goes and tells the price to the buyer. And if the price of the seller is higher than the price that the buyer quotes that he is willing to buy, the trade happens and the auctioneer gets a 10% commission. And we were like, this has a safe deviation. I can quote a higher price to the buyer and pocket the difference if the buyer accepts. Okay, so you tell me you're willing to sell at 3.2 million. I'm gonna say it was 3.5 million to the buyer, and if the buyer accepts, I will pocket the difference. This is a non-credible mechanism. If I'm intermediating between buyers and sellers, which was completely made up. It turns out, in this allegation case against Google, again, I repeat, this is an allegation, but Wall Street Journal wrote it. So that Google had this project Bernanke, and this is exactly the Ben Bernanke who won the Nobel Prize, by the way. And the idea was that Google was doing this auctioneering between New York Times and bidders, or the publishers and the bidders. Bidders come in without Ben Bernanke project. Bidders come in and bid 20, 16, 10, 5. Google is like, okay, the highest bidder is this guy, he wins, pays 16. I'm gonna get 20% of it as my take rate as the auctioneer and pay New York Times 12.8, the rest. With Project Bernanke, Google said, okay, let me drop this $16 bid, tell the New York Times that the second highest bid was 10, but tell the advertiser who won, this guy on the top, that the second highest bid was 16. I'm gonna pocket the difference, this $6 difference. I'm also gonna get 20% of this $10, pay New York Times 8, and we are gonna call this Bernanke pool. I'm just quoting from New York Times. I don't know whether this is right or wrong. So this is exactly this non-credibility of this middleman being between sellers and buyers. That if you're intermediating and getting a take rate, you cannot really trust the auctioneer.
If this is lowering the quality of the bid, why would it boost its own system over competitors if the bids are systematically worse after the program?
Well, I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but there is a huge level of market power here for Google. They are not absolutely monopolists, but they have a lot of market power.
I'm just reading the New York Times quote on the right lower corner. It says Google boosts its own system over competitors, but the project seemed to suggest that Google is actually lowering the bids on behalf of the bidder. So from the perspective of New York Times, they're seeing worse bids coming from Google, right? So wouldn't that make Google worse compared to its competitors? Why would it say it boosts itself over competitors?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to see. So, I mean, I didn't get to the details. So what Google claimed they did, maybe it's about this question you're asking, that they use this Bernanke pool later to supplement the bids of their own customers and make it more likely for them to win. That was their claim. So maybe that's what this is referring to. The point I was trying to make is that if this is right, it's pretty clear they didn't follow the rules of the game. That's the only thing I'm trying to point to. So I'm not gonna have enough time to go through theorems, and I totally expected that. But let me just tell you that the fact that first price auction is credible is by inspection. If you want revenue and you have a bunch of bids, the best thing you can do is to sell to the highest bidder at their bid. The fact that this is the unique credible mechanism comes from the observation that any credible mechanism should have the property that at the point that you put a report in the mechanism, you know in the auction, you know that if you win, you're gonna pay X. Because whenever there are two numbers you can pay, X and Y, and you don't know which one is gonna happen, the auctioneer can always charge you Y, the higher number. So surprisingly, or at least interestingly, this is also a feature of the ascending auction. So this is a shared feature of first price auction and ascending auction. In ascending auction, when I say, hey, I'm willing to pay $21 million, I may not win. But if I win, I know I'm gonna pay $21 million. So there is no other number. There is not a 22 million as an option on the table. Otherwise, the auctioneer is always gonna charge me that. So that's a shared feature. The type of the ascending auction that is credible, going back to Abdul's question, is just an ascending auction in which I have a grid of values. Anyone can have a value of 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, up to 100 million. And I observe my own communication with the bidder, but I don't know what's happening between other bidders and the auctioneer. And then you're gonna start at the reserve price, ask bidders back and forth, are you willing to pay X? Yes. Are you willing to pay X? Yes. X plus epsilon, X plus epsilon. He says yes, and then bidder 2 says no, and this is the payment. This auction is credible. I will not have time to prove it for you, but you guys can relatively easily show that increasing this bid from this point and charging bidder one more than what the rules of the game say, despite the fact that you can do that. That's a key point. I can tell this guy, hey, this guy accepted to pay 22 million. Are you willing to pay 23? I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that is that there is a chance that this guy says no. And the expected cost, because this guy may say no and I have no potential buyer, is outweighs the expected benefit of getting epsilon more dollars from this guy.
Does that argument rely on regularity at all, or?
It does rely on regularity, actually. You're totally right. If you look at the proof, it completely gets to the point that I show that the net cost is the virtual value. So if the virtual value is negative virtual value, so if the virtual value is positive, then you don't want to do that. But we can do ironed ascending auction too. So there is a way to do ironing for the ascending auction. So I'm going to close, given the fact that we don't have the reverse proof. By the way, the hardest proof in this paper is the reverse proof of this theorem, that there is no other dynamic protocol that gives you credibility and strategic goodness at the same time. So let me conclude by basically this picture that this notion of credibility managed to help characterize these three auctions. All three properties together are not possible. And it's even completely context dependent, which one of these properties you may like the most. Like in an online advertising world, you cannot have a dynamic mechanism. You have to have a static mechanism because of the limitations of the speed of light. In some settings, credibility is not important. You can totally trust the auctioneer, so you can run the second price auction. But which ones are crucial are not the point of this paper. The point is that credibility is a feature that first price auction and ascending auction share. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Mohammad.